Listen carefully, every pro-Netanyahu leader. I just chose justice over your genocide, and from the ruins of your diplomatic pressure rises African solidarity with Palestine you cannot break. You thought I'd stay silent on Gaza's destruction eternally. You believed your sanctions would force my compliance, and African leaders would betray principles while you murdered children and called it security. You were wrong. I condemn Netanyahu's actions in Gaza publicly. I recognized Palestinian sovereignty. Choose justice tonight or watch history record you as collaborators in ethnic cleansing while Africa chose the oppressed over the oppressor. Let me tell you exactly what happened. I recognize this immediately because African history is full of similar crimes committed by colonial powers who claimed they were defending civilization against savagery. The French massacred Algerian civilians and called it counterterrorism. The British starved Kenyans in concentration camps and called it security operations. The Portuguese burned Angolan villages and called it protecting settlers. The Belgians mutilated Congolese and called it maintaining order. Every colonial power in Africa justified atrocities by claiming they were defending themselves against barbaric natives who attacked first. The language was always the same. We're the victims defending ourselves. They're the terrorists threatening civilization. Netanyahu's language about Palestinians was identical to colonial language about Africans. He called them animals. He said Gaza must be destroyed completely. He claimed there were no innocent civilians because everyone supported Hamas. He demanded total war until Palestinian resistance was eliminated permanently. This wasn't language of legitimate defense. This was language of extermination, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide, and it was being broadcast globally while Western powers not only stayed silent but actively supported it with weapons, money, and diplomatic protection. The pressure on African leaders to support Israel or at least stay silent was immediate and intense. Israeli diplomats contacted governments across Africa with the same message. This is not your conflict. Stay out of it. Maintain neutrality. Preserve your relationship with Israel. Western ambassadors reinforced the message. Supporting Israel is supporting fight against terrorism. Criticizing Israel is supporting Hamas. Speaking against Israeli operations will damage your relationships with United States and Europe. The threats were implicit but clear. There would be consequences for African countries that condemned Israel's actions in Gaza. The incentives to stay silent were significant. Israel provides substantial military and security cooperation to multiple African countries. Israeli companies operate across Africa in agriculture, technology, security, and infrastructure. Trade between Israel and African countries had grown to billions of dollars annually. Israeli intelligence services maintained close relationships with African counterparts. Many African leaders had personal connections to Israeli officials built over years of cooperation. Breaking those relationships over Palestinian issue that didn't directly affect African interests seemed unnecessarily costly to many governments. Additionally, there was genuine complexity to the situation that gave African leaders excuse to avoid taking clear position. Hamas had indeed launched brutal attacks that killed Israeli civilians, including families with children. Hamas did use civilian infrastructure in Gaza for military purposes, making it harder to distinguish between legitimate military targets and civilian areas. Hamas did reject Israeli right to exist and committed to armed resistance that included terrorism. These facts made it easy for leaders who wanted to avoid controversy to claim both sides were wrong. Situation was complicated, and Africa should stay neutral rather than taking sides. But complexity and neutrality are luxuries you can afford when genocide isn't happening, when 15,000 children are being killed, when hospitals are being bombed, when entire population is being starved and denied water. Complexity becomes excuse for cowardice and neutrality becomes complicity. The question wasn't whether Hamas committed terrorism or whether Israel had right to respond. The question was whether collective punishment of 2 million civilians, including deliberate killing of thousands of children, constituted war crimes and crimes against humanity. The answer was obviously yes, regardless of what Hamas had done first. I refuse to stay silent because staying silent when genocide happens makes you collaborator in genocide. African history taught us that lesson through blood. When Rwanda's genocide occurred in 1994, international community stayed silent and 800,000 people were murdered in 100 days. When Darfur's genocide occurred in early 2000s, international community stayed neutral and hundreds of thousands died. When apartheid South Africa massacred black populations, many countries maintained neutrality in trade relationships while oppression continued for decades. Every time we chose silence over justice, the killing continued and history recorded our complicity. I spoke out immediately and clearly. I condemned Israel's collective punishment of Gaza's civilian population. I called Netanyahu's military operations war crimes and crimes against humanity. I demanded immediate ceasefire and humanitarian access to Gaza. I recognized that what was happening wasn't defense, but ethnic cleansing designed to force Palestinians from their land. I said publicly what many leaders said privately: this was genocide, and the world was watching it happen in real time while doing nothing to stop it. The response from pro-Israeli governments and leaders was swift and furious. Israeli Foreign Ministry summoned my ambassador and issued formal protest. Israeli media outlets attacked me personally, calling me terrorist sympathizer and anti-Semite. Pro-Israeli organizations across Africa and internationally launched campaigns condemning my statements and demanding I retract them. Western ambassadors expressed disappointment in my position and warned it would affect bilateral relationships. Other African leaders privately criticized me for damaging Africa's relationships with Israel and Western powers over issue that didn't affect African interests directly. The accusations of anti-Semitism were particularly cynical and offensive. Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jewish people because they are Jewish. Condemning Israeli government's war crimes is not anti-Semitism any more than condemning apartheid South Africa's crimes was anti-white racism. Opposing policies is not the same as hating people. Demanding accountability for killing 15,000 children is not bigotry. Using accusations of anti-Semitism to silence legitimate criticism of genocide is itself deeply offensive to real victims of actual anti-Semitism. Many Jewish people around the world opposed Netanyahu's actions in Gaza and protested against the genocide. Thousands of Jews in United States, Europe, and even Israel itself demonstrated against the bombing campaign and called for ceasefire. Jewish organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace condemned Israeli war crimes. Israeli soldiers refused to serve in Gaza operations they considered immoral. These Jews were also accused of anti-Semitism by pro-Netanyahu governments and organizations, which proved the accusations had nothing to do with protecting Jews and everything to do with silencing criticism of Israeli government policies. The pressure escalated as I refused to back down. Trade delegations were canceled, military cooperation agreements were suspended, Israeli companies operating in Burkina Faso were instructed to review their investments. Western aid organizations quietly indicated that my position on Gaza was noticed and would be a factor in future funding decisions. Other African leaders who had previously maintained good relationships with me grew distant, not wanting to be associated with controversial positions that might damage their own relationships with Israel and Western powers. But I had support as well. Ordinary Africans across the continent rallied behind my position. Protests erupted in multiple African countries demanding their governments condemn Israeli actions in Gaza. Social media exploded with Africans drawing connections between Palestinian struggle and African liberation struggles against colonialism and apartheid. Religious leaders, particularly Muslim leaders but also Christians, praised my courage in speaking truth. Pan-African organizations endorsed my position and called on all African countries to condemn genocide in Gaza. The African street was overwhelmingly on side of justice, even when African governments chose silence. South Africa took the most dramatic action of any African country by filing genocide case against Israel at International Court of Justice. The case meticulously documented Israeli military operations, government statements, and systematic destruction of Gaza's civilian infrastructure to argue that Israel was committing genocide under international law. The case was juridically strong and morally unassailable. South Africa faced immediate backlash from Israel and Western powers, but the case forced international legal community to confront what was happening in Gaza rather than allowing diplomatic language and neutrality to obscure reality. I publicly supported South Africa's genocide case and called on other African countries to join it. I argued that Africa had special responsibility to oppose genocide because we had experienced genocide ourselves and knew the cost of international silence. I said African countries that stayed neutral or supported Israel were betraying our own history and principles. I challenged every African leader directly. Explain how you can condemn colonialism and apartheid that oppressed your people while supporting or staying silent about colonialism and apartheid that oppresses Palestinians. The comparison between Palestinian situation and African struggles against colonialism and apartheid was exact and undeniable. Palestinians were indigenous population whose land was colonized by settler population that displaced them through force. Palestinians lived under military occupation that controlled their movement, access to resources, and basic rights. Palestinians were subject to different legal systems than Israeli settlers, with Palestinians having fewer rights and facing harsher punishments. Palestinian land was being steadily seized through illegal settlements that violated international law. Palestinian resistance to occupation was labeled terrorism, while settler violence against Palestinians was ignored or justified. This was textbook colonialism and apartheid that Africans had fought against for generations. Israel's relationship with Africa historically made current African silence even more hypocritical. During apartheid era, Israel maintained close military and economic relationship with apartheid South Africa, even as most of world imposed sanctions. Israel sold weapons to apartheid regime and provided nuclear technology that helped South Africa develop nuclear weapons program. Israeli companies profited from apartheid system while black South Africans suffered under racist oppression. Israel only ended apartheid collaboration after international pressure became overwhelming and apartheid regime was clearly doomed. When African countries began gaining independence in 1960s, Israel initially cultivated strong relationships across continent through development aid and technical assistance. But during 1970s, most African countries broke diplomatic relations with Israel in solidarity with Palestinians and in response to Israeli support for apartheid South Africa and colonial regimes. African unity on Palestinian issue lasted for decades until economic interests and security cooperation gradually eroded it in 1990s and 2000s. By 2023, most African countries had restored relations with Israel and many maintained close partnerships. This history meant African silence during Gaza genocide represented betrayal of our own principles and historical positions. African countries that once stood with Palestinians against Israeli occupation now stayed silent while Israel conducted genocide. African leaders who came to power through liberation struggles against colonialism now refuse to condemn colonialism when Palestinians experienced it. African governments that once prioritized solidarity with oppressed peoples now prioritize trade relationships and security cooperation with oppressor. The transformation was complete betrayal of African liberation ideology that had defined continent's politics for generations. I refuse to participate in that betrayal because my legitimacy as revolutionary leader came from opposing oppression, not collaborating with it. I came to power by overthrowing government that served French interests rather than Burkinabe interests. I justified my revolution by promising to pursue African sovereignty and liberation rather than continuing neo-colonial dependence. I built my popular support by challenging Western domination and asserting African dignity. If I stayed silent while genocide happened, if I prioritized relationships with Israel over justice for Palestinians, I would be exposing myself as hypocrite who opposed oppression only when it was convenient and profitable. The principle was simple and absolute. You cannot claim to oppose oppression while staying silent about genocide. You cannot condemn colonialism in your own history while ignoring colonialism in present. You cannot demand justice for your people while denying justice to other oppressed peoples. You cannot build legitimacy through liberation rhetoric while collaborating with oppressors. Either you stand for justice consistently, or you stand for nothing except your own interests. I chose justice. My message to every pro-Netanyahu leader in Africa is direct and uncompromising. Your silence makes you complicit in genocide. Every day you refuse to condemn Israel's war crimes, more Palestinian children die. Every time you prioritize trade relationships over Palestinian lives, you betray principles your countries were founded on. Every moment you maintain normal relations with Israel while Gaza burns, you collaborate in ethnic cleansing. Your excuses about complexity and neutrality fool no one. Your claims about needing to balance relationships convince nobody. Your silence speaks louder than any statement. You value money and weapons more than children's lives. History is recording your choices right now. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when Gaza genocide is studied like Rwanda genocide and Holocaust, your position will be documented. Your grandchildren will ask what you did when genocide happened in real time with television cameras broadcasting it globally. You will have to explain why you stayed silent, why you maintained relationships with perpetrators, why you chose trade deals over justice. You will be remembered as collaborators in genocide, as leaders who had opportunity to stand for justice and chose complicity instead. The excuse that Palestine doesn't affect African interests directly is morally bankrupt and strategically stupid. Injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere because it establishes precedent that powerful countries can commit atrocities without consequences if they have right allies. If Israel can commit genocide in Gaza while maintaining normal relationships with African countries, then any powerful country can commit atrocities against Africans without facing consequences. The principle that human rights and international law should protect everyone becomes meaningless if we only defend them when politically convenient. Moreover, Palestinian struggle is African struggle because both are struggles against colonialism, apartheid, and dehumanization. The same ideology that justified colonizing Africa justified colonizing Palestine. The same racist logic that portrayed Africans as backward savages who needed civilizing portrayed Palestinians as terrorists who threatened civilization. The same international system that enabled European colonization of Africa enabled Israeli colonization of Palestine. The same Western powers that supported apartheid in South Africa support apartheid in Israel. Our struggles are connected by shared oppression and shared enemy, systems of domination that deny our humanity and steal our land. Some African leaders justified their silence by claiming they needed Israeli military technology and security cooperation to fight terrorism and insurgency. This excuse revealed both moral bankruptcy and strategic incompetence. It was morally bankrupt because it meant African leaders valued military equipment more than opposing genocide. It was strategically incompetent because it assumed Israel was only source of security technology and that maintaining relationships with country committing genocide wouldn't have political costs. The reality was that multiple countries provided military technology without requiring African complicity in genocide. Russia supplied weapons and training without demanding we support Israeli war crimes. China offered security cooperation without insisting we stay silent about Palestinian suffering. Turkey provided drones and equipment while vocally condemning Israeli genocide. African countries could meet their security needs through partnerships that didn't require betraying our principles. Staying silent about Gaza for Israeli weapons was choice, not necessity. Additionally, the political costs of supporting or staying silent about Israeli genocide were massive among African populations. Muslims across Africa were outraged by their government's failure to defend Palestinians. Young Africans compared Palestinian struggle to African liberation struggles and condemned their leaders' hypocrisy. Civil society organizations protested against governments that maintained normal relations with Israel during genocide. The domestic political damage from complicity in genocide would eventually exceed any benefits from Israeli military cooperation. Some leaders claimed they were working quietly through diplomatic channels rather than making public statements. This excuse was cowardice disguised as sophistication. Quiet diplomacy is appropriate for resolving disputes between parties who want resolution. It is not appropriate response to genocide. Genocide requires public condemnation because genocide is public crime that depends on international complicity through silence. Quiet diplomacy during genocide allows perpetrators to continue killing while claiming international community doesn't consider their actions serious enough to warrant public criticism. If quiet diplomacy was effective, Netanyahu would have agreed to ceasefire within days or weeks of military operations beginning. Instead, genocide continued for months while leaders claiming to work quietly achieved nothing. Their quiet diplomacy provided diplomatic cover for continued killing by creating impression that reasonable people on both sides were trying to reach understanding. But there was no both sides. There was occupying power committing genocide, and there was occupied population being exterminated. Quiet diplomacy between those parties was meaningless without public pressure forcing occupier to stop killing. Other leaders cited complexity of Middle East politics and Israel-Palestine conflict's long history as reasons to avoid taking clear position. This excuse demonstrated either profound ignorance or deliberate dishonesty. The complexity was irrelevant to fundamental question of whether killing 15,000 children and deliberately destroying civilian infrastructure constituted war crimes. Whatever legitimate security concerns Israel had, collective punishment was illegal under international law. Whatever historical grievances existed between Israelis and Palestinians, genocide was impermissible under any circumstances. The long history of conflict didn't justify present atrocities any more than long history of ethnic tensions in Rwanda justified genocide there. Historical complexity is what academic conferences discuss. Genocide is what military forces commit. When genocide is happening, the appropriate response is stop the genocide immediately and sort out historical complexity afterward. Any African leader who claimed situation was too complex to condemn killing 15,000 children was either incompetent or complicit. Some leaders worried that condemning Israel would damage relationships with United States and European countries that strongly supported Israel. This concern revealed how thoroughly neo-colonial mentality still dominated African political thinking. African leaders were willing to stay silent about genocide because they feared Western powers would be angry if they spoke truth. They prioritized maintaining good relationships with Washington and European capitals over defending fundamental human rights and international law. They assumed African countries had no choice but to align with Western positions regardless of justice or African interests. This neo-colonial mentality ignored transformed global landscape where African countries had alternatives to Western partnerships. China was Africa's largest trading partner and didn't require African countries to support Israeli genocide. Russia offered military cooperation without demanding silence about Palestinian suffering. Gulf states provided investment while vocally opposing Israeli actions. Turkey, Iran, and other non-Western powers maintained relationships with African countries that opposed Israeli war crimes. African countries that feared losing Western support by condemning genocide could replace Western partnerships with alternatives that respected African sovereignty and moral positions. Moreover, the assumption that condemning genocide would seriously damage relationships with Western powers was questionable. Western countries maintained relationships with multiple governments that criticized Israeli actions, including South Africa, Turkey, and various Latin American countries. Western powers were transactional. They maintained relationships based on interests, not agreement on every issue. African countries that believed condemning genocide would end Western relationships were overestimating African importance to Western powers and underestimating Western pragmatism. But even if condemning genocide did damage relationships with Western powers, that would be price worth paying. What value is relationship that requires you to stay silent about genocide? What legitimacy does government have that prioritizes foreign relationships over fundamental human rights? What sovereignty does country possess if it cannot speak truth about atrocities because foreign powers might be offended? African leaders who stayed silent about Gaza because they feared Western reaction revealed themselves as puppets who governed with Western permission rather than leaders who governed with African authority. I condemned Israeli genocide despite threats and pressure because my authority comes from Burkina Bay people, not from Washington or Tel Aviv. My government's legitimacy is based on pursuing African interests and defending African principles, not on maintaining good relationships with every foreign power. My responsibility is to speak truth, even when truth is uncomfortable or costly, not to stay silent because powerful countries prefer silence. I govern Burkina Faso for Burkina Bay people and African dignity, not for Israeli weapons or American approval. The genocide in Gaza continued for months with over 40,000 Palestinians killed, over 70% of Gaza's buildings damaged or destroyed, and over 90% of population displaced from their homes. The humanitarian catastrophe was unprecedented in scale and brutality. International organizations documented systematic destruction of hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, universities, and civilian infrastructure. Israeli forces deliberately targeted humanitarian workers, journalists, and medical personnel. Food, water, electricity, and medical supplies were blocked from entering Gaza, creating conditions of famine and disease. The stated Israeli objective evolved from defeating Hamas to making Gaza uninhabitable to forcing mass deportation of Palestinians. Throughout this catastrophe, majority of African governments maintained silence or issued weak statements calling for both sides to show restraint, as if there were moral equivalence between occupying power committing genocide and occupied population being exterminated, as if calls for restraint were appropriate response to deliberate ethnic cleansing, as if African countries had no responsibility to oppose genocide happening in real time with full documentation. The silence was deafening and the complicity was complete. A few African governments joined me in condemning Israeli genocide clearly and forcefully. South Africa filed its historic genocide case. Algeria consistently condemned Israeli war crimes in international forums. Tunisia recalled its diplomats and severed ties with Israel. Several West African and North African countries issued strong statements demanding immediate ceasefire and Israeli accountability. These governments honored African principles of opposing colonialism and supporting oppressed peoples. They demonstrated that African countries could pursue African interests and maintain African dignity without collaborating in genocide. But majority of African governments failed this moral test catastrophically. They stayed silent while genocide happened. They maintained normal relations with Israel while Palestinians were exterminated. They prioritized trade relationships and military cooperation over opposing atrocities. They betrayed Palestinian people who had supported African liberation struggles for decades. They betrayed African principles of solidarity with oppressed peoples. They betrayed their own populations who demanded their government stand for justice. Most fundamentally, they betrayed themselves by revealing that their liberation rhetoric was performance rather than principle. My message to pro-Netanyahu African leaders is that your failure is recorded and will be remembered. You had opportunity to stand for justice when justice required courage, and you chose silence because silence was comfortable. You had chance to honor African liberation principles, and you prioritized foreign relationships instead. You could have opposed genocide, and you stayed neutral because neutrality seemed safe. Your choices revealed your character. You are not leaders who stand for African dignity and liberation. You are managers who maintain relationships and pursue profits regardless of justice. When Palestinian liberation eventually comes, as all liberation eventually comes, Palestinians will remember which African countries stood with them and which stayed silent or supported their oppressors. When next generation of African youth studies this period, they will judge you for your complicity in genocide. When African people look back on this moment, they will recognize that you valued Israeli weapons and Western approval more than children's lives. Your legacy will be shame rather than honor, complicity rather than courage, betrayal rather than solidarity. My message to Western powers that demanded African silence is equally direct. You exposed yourselves as hypocrites who lecture about human rights while enabling genocide. You claim to support rules-based international order while protecting Israel from accountability for war crimes. You insisted African countries respect democracy and human rights while you supplied weapons used to kill Palestinian children. You demanded we condemn terrorism while you enabled state terrorism on massive scale. Your moral authority is destroyed permanently by your actions in Gaza. Every time Western ambassadors lecture African countries about corruption, human rights violations, or democratic deficits, we will remember Gaza. We will remember that you enabled genocide while demanding we meet your standards. We will remember that you protected Israel from accountability while insisting we face consequences for lesser crimes. We will remember that your principles applied only to weak countries while powerful allies received unconditional support regardless of atrocities. Your hypocrisy is complete and undeniable. My message to Palestinian people is that some Africans maintained solidarity even when governments betrayed you. African populations across continent demonstrated for Palestinian liberation despite government silence. African civil society organizations condemned Israeli genocide despite official neutrality. African youth drew connections between your struggle and ours despite attempts to divide us. The silence of African governments does not represent silence of African peoples. We see you, we stand with you, we will not forget you. The historical connection between Palestinian liberation struggle and African liberation struggles is profound and permanent. Palestinians supported African decolonization movements throughout 1950s and 60s when few others did. PLO provided training, weapons, and diplomatic support to African liberation movements fighting colonialism and apartheid. Yasser Arafat maintained close relationships with African revolutionary leaders including Nelson Mandela, who never abandoned Palestinian cause even after becoming South African president. Palestinians understood African oppression because they experienced same oppression from same systems of colonialism and apartheid. African liberation movements returned that solidarity by supporting Palestinian struggle consistently until economic interests corrupted African governments in recent decades. The current betrayal by African governments represents temporary failure of leadership rather than permanent shift in African people's solidarity with Palestinian liberation. When Gaza genocide finally ends and Palestinian freedom eventually comes, African peoples will celebrate alongside you because your liberation is connected to ours. My message to Global South countries that stayed silent is that you missed historic opportunity to assert moral leadership and demonstrate solidarity among oppressed peoples. Latin American countries, Asian countries, and African countries that remained neutral while genocide happened chose short-term interests over long-term principles. You allowed Western powers and Israel to commit atrocities without facing meaningful consequences from majority of world's population. You proved that post-colonial solidarity was rhetoric rather than reality. Your failure weakened Global South's collective power and legitimacy. If majority of Global South countries had united to condemn Israeli genocide, impose sanctions, sever diplomatic relations, and demand accountability, Western powers could not have enabled continued atrocities without severe costs. International isolation of Israel would have forced either policy change or made explicit that Western powers would support genocide regardless of international opinion. Either outcome would have strengthened Global South's position. Either we would have stopped genocide through collective action, or we would have exposed Western hypocrisy so completely that their moral authority would evaporate permanently. Instead, Global South countries stayed silent or neutral, allowing Western powers and Israel to continue genocide while maintaining fiction of international consensus. This failure confirmed Western powers' assessment that Global South countries can be divided through economic incentives and intimidated through pressure. It demonstrated that post-colonial solidarity remains weak and inconsistent. It showed that Global South countries have not yet developed collective consciousness and coordinated action necessary to challenge Western dominance effectively. The Gaza genocide revealed Global South's weakness as much as Western hypocrisy. But the failure also created opportunity for leaders willing to break from complicity and assert principles over interests. Countries that condemned Israeli genocide and took concrete actions demonstrated alternative path where Global South countries prioritized justice and solidarity over maintaining relationships with Western powers and their allies. South Africa's genocide case at ICJ proved that middle-income countries can challenge powerful nations through international legal mechanisms. Turkey's suspension of trade with Israel showed that significant economies can impose costs for atrocities. Latin American countries that severed diplomatic relations demonstrated that solidarity has practical meaning beyond rhetoric. My choice to condemn Israeli genocide and challenge African leaders who stayed silent positioned Burkina Faso as voice for principled stance over pragmatic silence. It established that revolutionary governments prioritize justice over relationships regardless of costs. It proved that African countries can speak truth about Western-enabled atrocities without apologizing or moderating positions to maintain diplomatic niceties. It demonstrated what African leadership could be if we honored liberation principles rather than betraying them for economic interests. The consequences of my position were real and costly. Israeli diplomatic presence in Burkina Faso ended. Trade and investment relationships with Israeli companies were suspended. Military cooperation programs were canceled. Western countries that strongly supported Israel expressed displeasure through reduced cooperation. Other African leaders distanced themselves to avoid being associated with controversial positions. The costs were significant and tangible, but the benefits were more significant. Burkina Faso's moral authority among African populations increased dramatically. Young Africans across continent celebrated Burkina Faso's principled stance while criticizing their own government's silence. Muslim communities viewed Burkina Faso as defender of Palestinian rights when many Muslim-majority governments stayed quiet. Pan-African organizations praised Burkina Faso leadership on global stage. Alternative partnerships with countries that opposed Israeli genocide strengthened as those countries recognized Burkina Faso as a reliable partner on principle rather than convenience. Most importantly, my choice to prioritize justice over pragmatism reinforced revolutionary legitimacy of my government domestically. Burkina Faso people supported my position overwhelmingly because it demonstrated that their government stood for principles rather than interests. It proved that revolutionary rhetoric about African dignity and anti-imperialism was genuine rather than performance. It showed that Burkina Faso would not be intimidated or bought by powerful countries demanding silence about atrocities. The domestic political benefit of principled stance exceeded any costs from damaged foreign relationships. The broader impact of my position in South Africa's genocide case was forcing conversation about Israeli atrocities that Western powers wanted to suppress. By speaking clearly about genocide, we made it impossible to maintain fiction that Israel was conducting legitimate defense operations. By documenting war crimes systematically, we created legal and historical record that will eventually hold perpetrators accountable. By refusing to be silent, we ensured that complicity of governments that enabled or ignored genocide will be remembered and judged by history. The International Court of Justice's preliminary ruling on South Africa's genocide case, while not reaching final determination on genocide, found that Palestinians in Gaza faced plausible risk of genocide and ordered Israel to prevent genocidal acts and allow humanitarian access. The ruling vindicated claims that Israel's actions constituted potential genocide rather than legitimate military operations. It established legal basis for viewing Israeli operations as war crimes subject to international law. It created precedent that powerful countries cannot commit atrocities with complete impunity even when supported by Western powers. Every African leader who stayed silent during Gaza genocide must now explain why they couldn't see what International Court of Justice confirmed. Israel's actions constituted plausible genocide. They must explain why they maintained normal relations with country committing potential genocide. They must explain why they prioritized trade and military cooperation over opposing atrocities that international court ruled created risk of genocide. Their silence is no longer defensible as neutrality or diplomatic caution. It was complicity in genocide that international legal body confirmed was plausible. My message to every pro-Netanyahu leader remains direct and uncompromising. Choose justice or history will remember you as collaborators. You still have time to change your position, condemn Israeli war crimes, support Palestinian rights, and join effort to hold perpetrators accountable. You still have opportunity to honor African liberation principles and stand with oppressed rather than oppressors. You still have chance to explain to your people why you initially stayed silent and why you finally found courage to speak truth. The window for redemption is closing, but it hasn't closed completely. Leaders who stayed silent initially can still reverse course, issue clear condemnations of Israeli genocide, recall ambassadors from Tel Aviv, sever military and economic cooperation agreements, and join South Africa's genocide case at International Court of Justice. You can still explain that you initially hesitated because you didn't fully understand the scale of atrocities, that you relied on incomplete information from biased sources, that you underestimated Israel's willingness to commit genocide publicly. These explanations won't erase your initial complicity, but they will demonstrate capacity for moral growth and willingness to prioritize justice over convenience. You can still speak to your parliaments and populations, admitting that you failed to act quickly enough when genocide began. You can acknowledge that economic interests and diplomatic relationships clouded your judgment initially. You can confess that pressure from Western powers and Israeli diplomats influenced your silence when you should have spoken truth. You can declare that you now recognize staying silent about genocide is unacceptable regardless of costs. You can commit publicly to opposing Israeli war crimes, supporting Palestinian liberation, and ensuring Africa never again stays silent while genocide happens. This path requires humility and courage, but it leads to redemption rather than permanent condemnation. You can mobilize African Union to take collective action against Israeli genocide. You can propose emergency sessions demanding immediate ceasefire, unrestricted humanitarian access, and international protection for Gaza's civilians. You can advocate for African countries to jointly sever diplomatic relations with Israel until genocide ends and perpetrators face accountability. You can lead efforts to impose economic sanctions, including blocking Israeli companies from operating in Africa and prohibiting African trade with Israel. You can coordinate with other Global South countries to create international coalition demanding Israeli accountability. These actions would demonstrate that your commitment to justice is genuine rather than rhetorical. You can leverage your relationships with Western powers to pressure them to stop enabling Israeli genocide. You can threaten to reduce cooperation on issues important to Western countries unless they stop supplying weapons used to kill Palestinian children. You can organize African boycotts of Western companies that support Israel militarily or economically. You can withdraw African participation from international forums dominated by Western powers until they stop protecting Israel from accountability. You can make clear that Africa will no longer cooperate with international system that enables genocide while claiming to support rules and human rights. These threats have power because Western countries need African cooperation on migration, counterterrorism, resource access, and geopolitical competition with China and Russia. You can provide material support to Palestinian people suffering under genocide. You can send humanitarian aid directly to Gaza through Egypt and other routes, bypassing Israeli blockade. You can offer medical treatment in African hospitals for wounded Palestinians who cannot receive care in destroyed Gaza health system. You can provide scholarships for Palestinian students whose universities were bombed. You can open immigration pathways for Palestinians fleeing genocide, demonstrating solidarity through concrete action rather than empty words. You can establish African Fund for Palestinian reconstruction once genocide ends, committing resources to rebuild what Israel destroyed. These actions would prove African solidarity with Palestinians is real and backed by material support. You can educate your populations about connections between Palestinian struggle and African liberation struggles. You can commission documentaries comparing Israeli apartheid to South African apartheid, Israeli colonization of Palestine to European colonization of Africa, Israeli genocide in Gaza to genocides Africans experienced. You can integrate Palestinian liberation into school curricula alongside African decolonization movements, teaching next generation that opposing oppression requires consistency rather than selective outrage. You can invite Palestinian speakers to African universities, cultural centers, and political forums to share their experiences and build people-to-people solidarity. You can establish sister city relationships between African cities and Palestinian cities, creating institutional connections that outlast individual governments. You can challenge pro-Israeli narratives that dominate Western media and influence African discourse. You can fund African media outlets that report honestly on Palestinian suffering and Israeli war crimes rather than repeating Western propaganda. You can train African journalists to investigate and document Israeli atrocities with same rigor Western journalists apply to African conflicts. You can create African fact-checking organizations that counter Israeli and Western disinformation about Gaza genocide. You can use your platforms to amplify Palestinian voices and African analysts who understand that Palestinian liberation is inseparable from African liberation. These efforts would combat information warfare that enables genocide by controlling how atrocities are portrayed and understood. But if you continue supporting Netanyahu's government or maintaining silence about genocide, if you continue prioritizing relationships with Israel over Palestinian lives, if you continue making excuses about complexity and neutrality while ethnic cleansing continues, then your complicity is deliberate and irredeemable. You will be remembered as African leaders who betrayed African principles when they were needed most. You will be judged as collaborators who enabled genocide through silence and support. You will be condemned as hypocrites who claim to oppose oppression while collaborating with oppressors. Your continued silence means you are choosing Israeli weapons and technology over 15,000 dead Palestinian children. You are choosing trade agreements worth millions of dollars over 40,000 Palestinian lives. You are choosing maintaining diplomatic relationships over opposing genocide that International Court of Justice ruled creates plausible risk of extermination. You are choosing comfort and convenience over justice and solidarity. These choices reveal your character completely. You are not liberation leaders. You are neo-colonial managers who serve foreign interests rather than African principles. Your excuses have been exposed as lies and cowardice. You claim situation was complex, but genocide is simple. Deliberately killing civilians and destroying infrastructure to make territory uninhabitable is war crime regardless of historical context. You claimed you needed balanced approach, but there is no balance between occupying power committing genocide and occupied population being exterminated. You claimed quiet diplomacy was more effective, but genocide continued for months while your quiet diplomacy achieved nothing except providing cover for continued killing. You claimed you couldn't afford to damage relationships with Israel and Western powers, but you could afford complicity in genocide that destroys your legitimacy and betrays African peoples. Your populations are watching your choices and judging you. African Muslims recognize that you failed to defend Palestinians when defense was desperately needed. African Christians see hypocrisy in condemning persecution of Christians in Middle East while ignoring Israeli bombing of churches in Gaza. African youth understand that you betrayed liberation principles you claim to represent. African civil society organizations document your complicity and organize resistance to your governments. African intellectuals write histories that will condemn your silence for generations. You are losing legitimacy among your own people by prioritizing foreign relationships over African principles and human decency. Your economic justifications for maintaining Israeli relationships are pathetically weak when examined honestly. Israeli trade with Africa totals only few billion dollars annually spread across entire continent, representing tiny fraction of African economies. Israeli military technology can be sourced from multiple alternative suppliers including Russia, China, Turkey, and others who don't require African complicity in genocide. Israeli agricultural expertise that you praise was developed through stealing Palestinian land and water, making it foundation built on crimes you should oppose rather than benefit you should seek. Israeli security cooperation you value so highly failed to prevent October 7th attacks despite Israel's massive intelligence apparatus, proving its effectiveness is vastly overstated. You are sacrificing justice for economic benefits that are minimal and replaceable. Your fear of Western reactions to condemning Israeli genocide reveals colonized mentality that still dominates African political leadership. You believe African countries cannot pursue independent foreign policies without Western permission. You assume Western powers will punish African countries that speak truth about genocide. You prioritize maintaining Western approval over defending African principles and human rights. You act like client states dependent on Western goodwill rather than sovereign nations capable of independent moral judgment. This mentality perpetuates neo-colonial dependency that keeps Africa weak and subordinate even after formal independence. The reality is that Western powers need African cooperation as much as Africa needs Western relationships. Europe depends on African resources, markets, and cooperation on migration management. United States needs African support in geopolitical competition with China and Russia. Both need African votes in international organizations and forums. African countries that condemned Israeli genocide would face some Western pressure, but that pressure would be limited by Western countries' own needs for African cooperation. And even if Western pressure was severe, the cost of maintaining principles and opposing genocide is worth paying compared to moral bankruptcy of enabling mass killing for economic convenience. Your failure to support Palestinian liberation contradicts everything you claim to believe about African liberation. You celebrate African independence from colonial rule while accepting Israeli colonization of Palestine. You condemn apartheid that oppressed black South Africans while maintaining relationships with Israeli apartheid state. You honor African martyrs who died fighting for freedom while ignoring Palestinian martyrs being killed by Israeli occupation. You demand reparations for European colonization of Africa while staying silent about ongoing Israeli colonization of Palestinian land. Your hypocrisy is complete and undeniable. The historical parallels between Palestinian struggle and African liberation struggles make your silence even more damning. Palestinians are fighting settler colonialism that seized their land through force and established exclusive state privileging settler population over indigenous population, exactly like European settlers did throughout Africa. Palestinians live under military occupation that controls their movement, access to resources, and basic rights through system of permits and checkpoints, exactly like apartheid South Africa controlled black population. Palestinians face systematic discrimination in legal system that treats them as inferior to Israeli settlers, exactly like colonial powers treated Africans as inferior to Europeans. Palestinians resist occupation through whatever means available while being labeled terrorists, exactly like African liberation fighters were labeled terrorists by colonial powers. Nelson Mandela understood these parallels perfectly when he declared that South African freedom was incomplete without Palestinian freedom. He maintained solidarity with Palestinians throughout his life despite pressure from Israel and Western powers to abandon them. He recognized that struggles against apartheid in South Africa and Palestine were connected by shared oppression and shared enemy, systems of racial domination and settler colonialism. He refused to betray Palestinians even when doing so would have been politically convenient. He chose justice and solidarity over pragmatism and interests. You dishonor his legacy and principles when you stay silent about Gaza genocide. The choice is yours, and the choice is simple: justice or complicity, courage or cowardice, principles or interests. I chose justice. I condemn genocide clearly and forcefully. I maintain solidarity with oppressed Palestinians despite pressure and costs. I honored African liberation principles that my revolution was based on. I spoke truth about Israeli war crimes when speaking truth was uncomfortable and costly. I chose what future generations will judge as right side of history. My choice to condemn Israeli genocide strengthened Burkina Faso domestically and internationally despite short-term costs. Domestically, Burkinabe people overwhelmingly supported my position because it demonstrated that revolutionary rhetoric about opposing oppression was genuine rather than performance. Young people especially celebrated that their government took principled stance rather than prioritizing economic interests. Muslim communities, which represent significant portion of Burkina Faso's population, viewed my condemnation of Israeli genocide as defense of their Palestinian brothers and sisters. Even Burkinabe, who disagreed with my position, respected that I acted based on principles rather than convenience. My moral authority increased because I proved willing to sacrifice relationships and face pressure rather than stay silent about genocide. Internationally, my position elevated Burkina Faso's standing among countries and populations that opposed Israeli genocide. Turkey, Iran, and other countries that vocally condemned Israeli war crimes recognized Burkina Faso as principled partner rather than pragmatic ally. Palestinian people and Arab populations across Middle East and North Africa viewed Burkina Faso as African country that honored solidarity. Global South civil society organizations celebrated Burkinabe leadership on human rights and anti-imperialism. Alternative media outlets that challenge Western narratives amplified my statements and contrasted Burkina Faso's courage with other African countries' cowardice. My government became symbol of principled resistance to Western-enabled genocide, enhancing Burkina Faso's soft power globally. The costs were real, but manageable. Israeli diplomatic pressure was meaningless because Israel has minimal leverage over Burkina Faso. Western displeasure was expressed but not acted upon aggressively because Burkina Faso already had difficult relationships with France and Western powers over other issues. Trade losses were minimal because Burkina Faso's economic relationships with Israel were limited. Military cooperation losses were irrelevant because Burkina Faso had already diversified security partnerships toward Russia and other non-Western powers. The threatened costs of condemning genocide turned out to be largely bluffs that disappeared when called. The benefits exceeded costs dramatically. My government's legitimacy strengthened domestically and internationally. Alternative partnerships with countries opposing Israeli genocide deepened. Burkina Faso's reputation as principled revolutionary state was confirmed. African youth across continent looked to Burkina Faso as a model for leadership based on justice rather than interests. Palestinian solidarity with Burkinabe revolution increased. The moral high ground my government occupies on Palestinian issue enhances authority on other international issues. The decision to choose justice over pragmatism proved correct strategically as well as morally. You must make the same choice now. Every day you delay, more Palestinians die, and your complicity deepens. Every statement you make that equates occupier and occupied, genocidal government and victimized population reveals your moral bankruptcy. Every relationship you maintain with Israel while Gaza burns proves you value profits over principles. Every excuse you offer about complexity and balance confirms you lack courage to stand for justice when justice requires sacrifice. Every single day of your continued silence means more Palestinian children are killed by Israeli bombs supplied by Western powers you refuse to challenge. Every week you maintain diplomatic relations with Israel means more Palestinian homes are destroyed deliberately to make territory uninhabitable. Every month you preserve trade agreements with Israel means more Palestinians starve because Israel blocks food and water systematically. Every year you stay silent about genocide means another generation of Palestinians grows up under occupation while African leaders who claim to oppose oppression do nothing. Your silence has body count attached to it. Your complicity has specific human costs. Your pragmatism kills children while you count trade figures. The International Court of Justice's ruling that found plausible risk of genocide in Gaza means you can no longer claim you didn't know or situation was unclear. International legal body confirmed what Palestinians and honest observers stated from beginning. Israel's actions constitute potential genocide under international law. The court ordered Israel to prevent genocidal acts, allow humanitarian access, and preserve evidence. Israel has violated these orders repeatedly while continuing operations that kill civilians systematically. Every day you maintain normal relations with Israel after ICJ ruling means you are deliberately maintaining relationships with country that international court found is plausibly committing genocide. Your complicity cannot be attributed to ignorance or confusion anymore. It is deliberate choice to prioritize relationships over justice. History is recording everything. Your words, your silence, your actions, your relationships. 20 years from now, when Gaza genocide is studied in schools and universities, your position will be documented. Your grandchildren will learn whether you stood for justice or collaborated in genocide. Your legacy will be determined by choice you make now. Speak truth about Israeli war crimes and demand accountability, or maintain complicity through silence and support. The historical record will show exactly what you did when genocide happened in real time with television cameras documenting every atrocity. It will document your statements calling for both sides to show restraint while one side committed genocide and other side was exterminated. It will record your diplomatic relationships maintained with Israel throughout genocide. It will list trade agreements and military cooperation programs you preserved while Palestinian children were killed. It will quote your excuses about complexity and balance and quiet diplomacy. It will compare your actions to leaders who had courage to condemn genocide clearly, and it will judge you accordingly. Your grandchildren will study this period in history classes and ask what you did when genocide happened. They will learn about Israeli bombing of hospitals, schools, mosques, and churches. They will see images of Palestinian children pulled dead from rubble. They will read testimonies from survivors describing deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure. They will study International Court of Justice ruling finding plausible risk of genocide, and they will ask why you stayed silent, why you maintained relationships with perpetrators, why you chose interests over justice. You will have to explain your choices to them, and your explanations will sound as hollow to them as they sound to everyone now. I made my choice. I chose justice. I chose Palestinian liberation. I chose African principles over foreign interests. I chose speaking truth over maintaining comfortable relationships. I chose being remembered as leader who stood for justice over being remembered as collaborator who enabled genocide. I chose to condemn Israeli genocide immediately and clearly, despite knowing it would damage relationships and provoke pressure. I chose to compare Israeli actions in Gaza to genocides and atrocities Africans experienced because historical parallels were exact and undeniable. I chose to challenge other African leaders publicly for their silence because their complicity demanded confrontation. I chose to support South Africa's genocide case at International Court of Justice because legal accountability matters. I chose to call for severing African diplomatic and economic relations with Israel because maintaining normal relationships with country committing genocide is unacceptable. I chose to stand with Palestinian people materially through offering humanitarian support and political solidarity. These choices reflect principles that guided my revolution in Burkina Faso. Opposing oppression requires consistency, not convenience. Liberation requires solidarity, not self-interest. Justice requires courage, not calculation. I overthrew Burkinabe government that served French interests rather than Burkinabe interests because I believed African countries should pursue African sovereignty and dignity. If I stayed silent while Palestinians suffered genocide, I would be betraying same principles that justified my revolution. My legitimacy depends on consistency between revolutionary rhetoric and revolutionary action. I cannot claim to oppose imperialism and colonialism while staying silent about Israeli imperialism and colonialism in Palestine. Every pro-Netanyahu African leader must make the same choice now. Choose justice or choose complicity. Choose courage or choose cowardice. Choose liberation principles or choose betrayal. Choose being judged by history as defender of oppressed or enabler of oppression. Choose Palestine or choose shame. The choice to support justice will cost you something. Israeli diplomatic pressure, Western displeasure, threatened trade losses, canceled military cooperation, attacks from pro-Israeli media and organizations. These costs are real and you must be prepared to bear them. But the costs of complicity are far greater: moral bankruptcy, betrayed principles, destroyed legitimacy, domestic opposition, historical condemnation, collaboration in genocide. The costs of choosing justice are temporary and manageable. The costs of choosing complicity are permanent and devastating. The choice to support justice will also benefit you significantly. Increase domestic legitimacy among populations that demand their governments stand for justice. Enhanced international standing among countries and peoples that oppose Israeli genocide. Strengthened moral authority on human rights and anti-imperialism. Alternative partnerships with countries that respect principled positions. Historical legacy as leader who chose justice over interests. These benefits exceed short-term costs of challenging Israeli genocide and Western powers that enable it. This is my message to every pro-Netanyahu leader. Your silence ends Palestinian lives and destroys your legitimacy. Your complicity enables genocide and betrays African principles. Your excuses convince nobody and fool nobody. Your choices reveal your character completely. You are collaborators in genocide unless you join fight for Palestinian liberation immediately and unequivocally. Your silence directly contributes to continued Palestinian suffering because international complicity enables Israeli genocide to continue. Every government that maintains normal relations with Israel while genocide happens sends message that genocide has acceptable costs for perpetrators. Every country that stays silent about Israeli war crimes tells Israel that international community won't impose serious consequences. Every leader who makes excuses about complexity and balance rather than demanding immediate ceasefire and accountability gives Israel diplomatic cover to continue killing. Your silence and complicity create an environment where Israel can commit genocide without facing international isolation, sanctions, or military intervention that would force policy change. If every African country united to condemn Israeli genocide, recall ambassadors, sever trade relationships, impose economic sanctions, and join South Africa's genocide case, Israel would face unprecedented international pressure from a continent of over 1 billion people. If African countries coordinated with other Global South countries to create united front demanding Israeli accountability, Western powers could not protect Israel from consequences without revealing their hypocrisy completely. If African leaders used their platforms consistently to condemn genocide and build global solidarity with Palestinians, Israeli propaganda narratives would collapse under weight of truth. Your silence prevents this united action and enables genocide to continue. The proof is in 40,000 Palestinian deaths, mostly civilians, including 15,000 children. It's in 70% of Gaza's buildings destroyed deliberately. It's in 2 million people displaced, starved, and denied water systematically. It's in International Court of Justice ruling that found plausible risk of genocide. It's in systematic destruction of hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, and civilian infrastructure. It's in Israeli officials' statements calling for complete destruction of Gaza and deportation of Palestinians. The genocide is documented completely and undeniably. Every single one of those 40,000 Palestinian deaths happened while world watched and most governments stayed silent or issued meaningless statements calling for restraint. Every destroyed building represents deliberate Israeli military operation targeting civilian infrastructure while international community did nothing to stop it. Every displaced Palestinian represents failure of international law and human rights systems that claim to protect civilians during conflict. Every starving child represents collective international abandonment of responsibility to prevent genocide. Every dead Palestinian is victim not only of Israeli military, but also of international complicity that enabled killing to continue. The International Court of Justice ruling confirming plausible risk of genocide means every death after that ruling carries additional weight of international legal confirmation. Israel is killing Palestinians after international court found its actions constitute potential genocide and ordered it to stop genocidal acts. Every country maintaining normal relations with Israel after ICJ ruling is deliberately maintaining relationships with country violating international court orders designed to prevent genocide. Your continued silence and relationships after ICJ ruling mean you are consciously enabling genocide that international legal body confirmed is plausible. The outcome depends on choices African leaders make now. If we unite to condemn genocide, demand accountability, impose costs on perpetrators, and maintain solidarity with Palestinians, we can contribute to ending atrocities and advancing Palestinian liberation. If we stay silent, maintain complicity, prioritize relationships with genocidal government, and betray liberation principles, we enable continued genocide and ensure our own condemnation by history. United African action could change international dynamics around Gaza genocide significantly. Africa represents over 1 billion people, 54 countries, massive natural resources, and growing economic and political power. Coordinated African condemnation of Israeli genocide would constitute major diplomatic defeat for Israel and Western powers protecting it. African severance of diplomatic relations would isolate Israel internationally beyond just predictable opposition from Iran and allies. African economic sanctions would impose real costs on Israeli economy and companies. African support for Palestinian statehood would strengthen international consensus behind two-state solution that Israel violates daily through settlement expansion. African testimony at international courts about our own experiences with colonialism, apartheid, and genocide would provide powerful historical context for understanding Israeli actions in Palestine. But African action requires African leadership, and African leadership requires African courage. Leaders must be willing to prioritize justice over economic interests, principles over diplomatic relationships, solidarity over pragmatism. Leaders must be willing to face Israeli pressure, Western displeasure, and domestic opposition from elites who benefit from maintaining status quo relationships. Leaders must be willing to explain to their populations why they initially failed to act and why they're finally choosing justice. Leaders must be willing to bear short-term costs for long-term moral authority and historical legacy. This is what justice requires. This is what African liberation principles demand. This is what opposing genocide means practically. Not complexity, not neutrality, not quiet diplomacy, not balanced statements, clear condemnation, concrete actions, severed relationships with perpetrators, solidarity with victims. Anything less is complicity. Justice requires stating clearly that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, that Israeli government and military are criminally responsible for war crimes, that Netanyahu personally bears responsibility for ordering operations that kill civilians systematically. Justice requires ending diplomatic recognition of Israel until genocide stops and perpetrators face accountability. Justice requires imposing comprehensive economic sanctions, including blocking Israeli companies from operating in Africa and prohibiting African trade with Israel. Justice requires supporting Palestinian statehood immediately and unconditionally. Justice requires providing material support to Palestinian people suffering under genocide. Justice requires nothing less than complete solidarity with Palestinians and complete opposition to Israeli genocide. African liberation principles demand consistency between our history and our present actions. We experienced colonialism and fought for independence. Palestinians experience colonialism and fight for independence. We lived under apartheid systems and resisted until they fell. Palestinians live under apartheid and resist daily. We suffered genocides and massacres at hands of colonial powers. Palestinians suffer genocide at hands of settler colonial power. We demanded international solidarity during our struggles. Palestinians deserve same solidarity during theirs. Either we honor our principles by standing with Palestinians, or we admit our principles were always rhetoric without substance. This is my message to every pro-Netanyahu leader. This is my challenge to African governments maintaining silence. This is my call to African peoples demanding your government stand for justice. Choose now. Choose justice. Choose Palestine. Choose liberation. Or choose shame, complicity, and betrayal that history will never forgive. The time for choosing is now, because genocide continues every single day while you hesitate and calculate and make excuses. Every hour you delay means more Palestinian children die. Every day you stay silent means more Palestinian homes are destroyed. Every week you maintain relationships with Israel means more Palestinians starve. Every month you choose complicity means more evidence accumulates of your collaboration in genocide. The urgency is absolute because human lives are ending while you debate political consequences.